In this video, I'm going to set up a brand new Active Directory domain. It's going to be used for testing some of Active Directory's more advanced features. What I have is a brand new, fresh install of Windows 2012 R2, and I'm going to go through the process of setting up that very first Active Directory domain controller. After that, we can build off of this test environment, and we can set up additional domain controllers, additional clients, and test out things like group policy. The first thing I want to establish on setting up a brand new Active Directory domain controller is I want to make sure that I have a static IP address set. Your domain controller shouldn't be moving around a whole lot because clients are going to need to find it for DNS and for Active Directory services. So I have set a static IP address 192.168.1.2 on my network card. I'm running this in a virtual machine so that I can test out several different servers at once in my test lab environment. Another thing that is pretty handy for us is being able to see all of our IP settings, and in this case I'm connected onto an internal Hyper-V network. Now you don't have to be connected to an internal Hyper-V network, but what you'll want to establish is whatever your DNS server is that you're using in your test environment, if you want to be able to see the rest of the world, you need to have that one set initially. We're going to see what happens after we install Active Directory, and it's going to change some things. And here's my static IP address. In order to install Active Directory, I'm going to need to add roles and features. Going through the Add Roles and Features wizard, I'm going to set up a role-based installation on my server, and I'm going to choose Active Directory Domain Services. When I select that, if I haven't already done so, it's going to prompt me to install some of the Active Directory tools. Normally you would want to say yes to this unless you strictly manage your Active Directory domain from some other computer. So I'm going to add the features. And then I'll say next. I don't want any additional features at this point, so I'll say next again. And it's going to give me a little bit of information about setting up Active Directory domain services on my server. A couple of the requirements that you might see are you really should have at least 2 domain controllers at all times. In a future video I'm going to show you what that works like, and certain things are going to change when you do have a multi-domain controller environment. But it's not too bad, and for any production system you would want more than 1 domain controller. Test environments, 1 is usually fine unless you're actually testing a multi-domain controller environment. And then we also need DNS. DNS is critical to having this system work. DNS is the roadmap for where to find things in Active Directory. If a client needs to find a domain controller, it always uses DNS. I find that 99% of the time, any Active Directory trouble is related to DNS. So make sure you have DNS established from the get-go. And I'm going to show you how I do that. There's a couple of other components that come along, like DFS, because there are some replication components to Active Directory which are really neat, and we're going to see when we do add a second domain controller. We won't need to do a restart yet, but we will later on. That's why it's kind of nice to do this in a virtual machine so we can reboot rather quickly and continue testing. It's going to bring along these things, and it's actually not going to complete the configuration of the domain controller in this process. Prior versions of Windows used to use a different application to start up the domain controller promotion process. It was DC Promo. But Active Directory Domain Services installation wizard is now in Server Manager in Server 2012. So we do need to go through the role installation process first. So I'll click install, and we'll let this run. This process doesn't normally take very long. All it's really doing is installing some binaries and getting them ready to be a domain controller. The actual domain controller promotion process doesn't happen until a little bit later. There's a couple of Active Directory tools that are pretty nice here. You're going to see the Active Directory Domain Services snap-ins, which work in the MMC, as well as the Active Directory Administrative Center, which is a new and in many ways better way to manage your users and computers. Some of the newer features in Active Directory that have come along since Windows 2008 R2 are only going to be available through the Active Directory Administrative Center. And one specifically is the Active Directory Recycle Bin, which is a fantastic tool for bringing back user accounts in case you accidentally delete something. So the process should go rather quickly, and now we need to promote this server to a domain controller. Now, oftentimes when people are in this add roles and features wizard, they tend to close out once it says everything's completed. So if you do happen to close that out, do not worry. You can go up here to the notifications area and you'll see that it's still waiting for you to promote this server to a domain controller. In order to do this, we're going to run the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard. This is a lot like DC Promo for anybody who's familiar with DC Promo from prior versions of Windows Server. At this point, we need to make a decision. Are we adding a domain controller to an existing domain? Are we adding a new domain to an existing forest? Or are we creating a brand new forest and brand new domain? In this case, I am starting from scratch, so I'm creating a brand new forest. In my case, I'll call it testdomain.com, just as a generic name of a domain for me to play around with here. The next thing it does is it actually checks to make sure that it can use that, and it's not already in use on the network. You'll notice this bar scrolling across the top. Sometimes some of these screens won't be active and it feels like the server's kind of frozen up. It's not exactly the best indicator that things are progressing, but things are actually progressing. You need to be a little more patient with Active Directory here in Windows 2012 R2. It does take a little longer to get things installed and set up. The first thing we're going to need to decide is what's the functional level of the forest in the root domain. This is an important choice because once we choose something newer, we can't go back to something older. If you plan on installing domain controllers from using older versions of Windows Server as your domain controller, this is where that decision is relevant. For example, a Windows 2008 server can't act like a 2012 R2 server. It just doesn't have the functionality. It doesn't have the features. So what level do we want our forest and our domain at? You can set the forest to anything you want, but the domains must be at least the level of the forest. And even though there are a few ways to work around rolling this back to a prior version, you should assume that once you upgrade this to a newer level of features and functionality, you cannot go back. You should just have your mind set on that because it's not always a very clean process. So that bar went away, which means it's time to continue. There's a few things that we're also going to need to choose here. Actually, we don't have a choice on the very first domain controller, but later on we will have the option. DNS must be installed with the first domain controller in a new forest, because DNS, as I said, is the roadmap to find everything in Active Directory. If we don't have that, we can't find our servers, and if we can't find our servers, we can't log in and take advantage of the features. A global catalog is required. There's at least one per forest. And since this is a new forest and this is the only domain controller on the forest, we have to have a global catalog server. And we cannot have a read-only domain controller as our very first domain controller either. That kind of makes sense because we need to be able to make changes on this first domain controller. Subsequent domain controllers could be read-only, but the first one has to be read-write. The only thing we're really changing here is we need to have a restore mode password. If Active Directory is not working and you need to restore it from backup, this will be the password that you need to use. So it needs to be relatively complex, but it's also very rarely used. This is something that you should probably keep track of carefully somewhere, because the time you need to do a restore is the time you're going to need to use this. And there's a good chance you won't be doing a restore for potentially many years, or it might be several admins later. So make sure that this is well documented. This is one of those things that when things go badly, you don't want to have to hunt around for a password like this. Make sure it's relatively complex, and make sure you keep it in a safe place. The next screen I have here refers to a delegation for the DNS server. And what that's saying is my DNS server cannot become the true owner of testdomain.com because I don't actually own testdomain.com. I'm using it as an example for this test lab. So I can't create a real DNS delegation. If you believe that you should be able to create a DNS delegation for the Active Directory domain you're creating, this could be a bit alarming, but in most cases, our Active Directory domain doesn't necessarily have to live on the true internet. It can be kind of off on its own. So I'll click Next and just pass on by that section. The next thing that we're doing is we're scanning the local network to make sure that I can use this particular domain as a NetBIOS name. Nobody else out there on my LAN should be using this particular name. If somebody else was using that particular name, you'd notice that it would throw some extra characters in there just to make sure it's isolated. The next question we are given is where to store the actual Active Directory database, the log files for that database, and the sys file. The database is normally not that big. In a large company, it will grow, and the more objects you have in Active Directory, the larger it'll get. So it should be, as with any database, it should be on a relatively fast drive that is okay with seeking around to different parts of the drive. The log files folder, which also defaults here in the same path, in a busy server might be better suited for something that does a lot of sequential reads and writes. Because log files tend to be written one line after another, a slower drive is sometimes more acceptable, but you don't normally want a hard drive that's bouncing all around looking at things in a database trying to also write sequential files. It's going to hurt your performance. It's two different activities on the same drive. So in many cases, on a busy server, it is recommended for this to be a different physical drive. In many, many cases, this database is not going to grow really large or become overly trafficked, so it's normally not a crucial issue unless you're in a fairly large company. And the sysfile folder. This is a folder that gets replicated between all domain controllers. It can be as large as you see fit. It's going to hold login scripts, it's going to hold group policy objects, and you, as the administrator, have the power to use this as a replicated file system between your domain controllers and potentially between different physical locations. So if you like to use the sysfile for storage of a lot of things, consider leaving this on a larger disk. I only have one disk in my test environment, so I'll leave everything as it is. Here's a review of all of our selections, and then we can say next. Another thing that's kind of nice about this, though, is if you ever did want to try and convert this to a PowerShell environment, here's your PowerShell script. It takes care of all the syntax for you, and these are all the choices that you've made. We could just copy this and dump it right into PowerShell and run all of this from PowerShell instead. I'll say next, and the server will now install Active Directory, and many things are going to go by here. If I didn't already have DNS, and I happen to on this test server, but if I didn't already have DNS, it would install DNS. It's going to set up a ton of new default records, including my administrator account, some test groups. It's going to install all of my DNS records. It's going to install a ton of different things in that Active Directory database, and you'll see them fly by as the installation proceeds. Some of the prereqs are also important. It may warn you about things like not having a static IP address, which is normally a bad thing on a DNS server. A DNS server is normally put in just as an IP address. And if that IP address is going to change, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. So again, a static address is really preferred on this. Now, with my prerequisites check, there were a couple of warnings. One has to do with some default security settings that makes things compatible with Windows NT. That's a choice you might need to make depending on your environment. And I have one adapter that doesn't have a static IP address, which is true. Looking back here in my local server, I actually have two network cards. One is currently not connected, but it is actually set to use DHCP. This is not a deal breaker, as long as I do have my one network card that is static. It's warning me that I'm going to run into some trouble with that. The delegation couldn't be created because I can't actually talk to the internet and claim testdomain.com for my own. I'm using it only for testing purposes. But I do still pass the prerequisite check because none of these are deal breakers. Now the installation can actually proceed. When it's done, it will reboot on its own. There won't be any other interaction from me as the administrator until my server is fully installed as a domain controller. My server is rebooted, and it's brought me back to the login screen. At this point, I need to press Ctrl-Alt-Delete to sign in. So, since it is a virtual machine, I will use the button here. And now you'll see that instead of clicking on a user, testdomain/administrator is the default administrator account that I can sign in with. So I'll sign in. There is no local administrator account per se anymore, because what happens instead is this server throws away its local SAM database, or at least disables it for now, and it uses the Active Directory database as its local database. So the only users that are really on this server are those that are part of test domain. It completely buys into being on the domain. Now I should have all of my new Active Directory tools that I can work with, and I can manage my users from here. I can use Active Directory Administrative Center to set up some more advanced features, as well as handle users, groups, and organizational units. And in addition, I should have some new settings in my DNS. For example, in my server here, I now have a new forward lookup zone called testdomain.com. This was created for me automatically. And this is where all of the entries for my server and other computers on my network are going to be. One other thing that's kind of interesting has to do with my IP settings. When I take a look at my adapter, I still have my static IP address, but my DNS servers got changed. And that's because my server now points to itself for DNS, because it needs to be able to find its own records for DNS, including those of other servers. So what actually happens here, which is kind of a neat feature, is it uses its own DNS server, which is right here, and it takes the DNS server that I used to be using and it makes it a forwarder. So anything that it can't resolve is going to pass along to the server that used to be set as the primary DNS server in the list. So I should still be able to resolve any addresses, and it should still flow through the chain that I've created for DNS, but now everything's pointing to this machine for DNS, which is excellent. All of my Active Directory records are up here with these underscores. So if you are a computer that wants to talk to the testdomain.com network, and you want to use TCP to connect to the Kerberos service, you would actually query for this record. And the answer to that query would be, here's the server that you can talk to in order to gain access to Kerberos. And then from there I can resolve server 1, get this IP address, and talk directly to my Kerberos server, which is my Active Directory authentication system. In future videos, I'm going to take a look at adding domain controllers, working with users, groups, organizational units, and all kinds of group policy stuff. So take a look at some of the other videos to continue on with learning about Active Directory.